Home computers, for much of their infancy, were a very restrictive thing. Between the expertise required to operate them and the general pricing issues, up until the late 80s at least, home PCs were somewhat niche. For example, at the time of its release, the Commodore 64 cost the equivalent of nearly $2,000 in 2024. And with how quickly the technological arms race was moving at the time, there was no guarantee that it was going to be competitive technology for very long. It wasn't until the early to mid-90s when standardization of operating systems and several manufacturers attempting to race to the bottom meant that even low-income families could own a PC. And it was at that point when they started to become as common as water. Hell, my family got their first home PC as a promotion for buying a fridge, I think. But with that said, PC gaming was still as restrictive as it had always been. Sure, you could run word processing programs and basic other programs on bottom-end PCs just fine. But at least on the cutting edge, system requirements to run the latest and greatest games simply weren't available to most casual audiences. Most people who played on the absolute most cutting edge tech were often enthusiasts, and more to the point, were adults with jobs who could afford these things. But that meant that there was a gap in the market where you had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children with mid-range family PCs who might have been interested in playing games on their PC, but would only be able to run modestly demanding games. And one of the companies that decided to make that gap in the market their niche was Humongous Entertainment. Humongous Entertainment was formed in 1992 by Shelley Day, the business mind, and Ron Gilbert, the creative mind, both of whom are former LucasArts employees. As a matter of fact, the name Humongous Entertainment was suggested by another LucasArts employee, Tim Schafer, most famous nowadays for founding Double Fine. Thanks, Wikipedia. Now, I'm not too familiar with Shelley Day other than the fact that she was apparently convicted of fraud in 2005, but I'm familiar with Ron Gilbert, who was one of the creative spearheads of LucasArts, writing and directing such games as Maniac Mansion, Day of the Tentacle, and The Secret of Monkey Island. Games that were pretty big deals for their time, and more to the point, were showcases of boundless creativity in writing and puzzle design. So Humongous Entertainment had a really solid pedigree right from the moment the company was founded, and in particular, a solid pedigree in the realms of point-and-click adventure games. And they would go on to establish their brand of junior adventure games, point-and-click adventure games, which by the name you could probably tell were specifically aimed at kids. Of course, because it was aimed at kids, that meant they had to drastically simplify the concept of a point-and-click adventure game, which were known as one of the most frustratingly obtuse genres of games. That was mostly on Sierra and their habit of killing you if you walk 2 feet in the wrong direction, giving you points of no return where you could theoretically screw yourself out of beating the game, and of course having batshit insane logic. But even still, even the LucasArts standard wouldn't cut it. The spitting contest, for example. These had to be simple enough that even the youngest kids could bumble through them. With that said, it didn't mean that they couldn't showcase the creativity or imagination that the people behind the company were known for. Notably, every game in the catalog used the SCUMM engine, which stood for Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion, a lame meaning for a cool acronym. It's a unique game engine programmed by Ron Gilbert back when he was working for LucasArts, and even though LucasArts owned it on account of him developing it when he was working for them, they let him use it so long as he kept updating the engine for both companies. As far as I'm aware, they used it roughly until the company went defunct. Humongous Entertainment's first intellectual property was Putt-Putt. It's not something that I ever played growing up, but I was aware of it from demos and such. This was originally a bedtime story that Shelley Day came up with for her son about an anthropomorphic car and its non-anthropomorphic dog.
I was glad to help.
It's noted that while Shelley Day was the business mind of the team, handling all the admin while Ron Gilbert did most of the creative work, Shelley Day was involved on the creative end at points. This in particular was her biggest creative endeavor. Putt-Putt is their most prolific franchise, and probably the one they're most well known for, if nothing else than because of sheer volume. Which is ironic, given that both Shelley Day and Ron Gilbert came from LucasArts, a company known for quality over quantity, unlike Sierra, which was known for quantity over quality. Either way, Putt-Putt has no less than 7 main series entries, and a few spin-offs. Thankfully, the naming convention of Putt-Putt makes it so the games are fairly self-explanatory. You had Putt-Putt Joins the Parade in 1992, Putt-Putt Goes to the Moon in 1993, Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo in 1995, Putt-Putt Travels Through Time in 1997, Putt-Putt Enters the Race in 1999, Putt-Putt Joins the Circus in 2000, and Pep's Birthday Surprise in 2003. The only one to eschew the naming convention, but that game eschews a lot of things. This is a series that basically lives on the premise of anthropomorphic car goes on various adventures, which range from the mundane to the fantastical. And it definitely brings across that feeling of being like a children's pop-up book, where one day you're doing something as simple as going to a parade, which is something that kids enjoy, and the next you're going to the moon or traveling through time, things that kids are also interested in. I kinda wish they would have doubled down on this if I'm being honest, have the opening of every game be like opening a children's pop-up storybook. When I first played the first 2 games in the series, I assumed they were using an earlier version of the SCUMM engine, and as such had a different resolution which resulted in a different art style. But after doing a bit of research, I found that it's merely the fact that the first 2 games used traditional sprite-based graphics, like the games they worked on at LucasArts. The same applies, I believe, exclusively to another one of the early games that they made, Fatty Bear's Birthday Surprise.
There's a lot of work to do before Kayla wakes up. I want to make her a big, beautiful birthday cake.
Which is, as far as I'm aware, the only original property to never take off in the same way as the others. To the point where Fatty Bear was actually paired up with Putt-Putt in some spin-offs. Fatty Bear's Birthday Surprise was a very mundane and sleepy Calvin and Hobbes style adventure where a little girl's stuffed bear comes to life on the eve of her birthday, so he decides to make it special by preparing a birthday party for her, and as a matter of fact, this game has a connection to Putt-Putt in that it's one of only 2 games that lets you decorate a cake however you wish, the other being Pep's Birthday Surprise. Otherwise, it's definitely the most lackadaisical and mundane game in their catalog, which would make it make sense why it would never really take off in the same way as the other franchises, given the fact that while there were some fantastical elements surrounding a Toy Story-esque idea of toys coming to life, which actually predated Toy Story. Either way, the initial art style makes Putt-Putt incredibly flat and also makes it so he has an incredibly creepy smile plastered on his face 24/7. But around 1995, they decided to do away with sprite-based artwork across their entire catalog in favor of hand-drawn, hand-animated scenes. It looks crude in the sense that the animation is very simple, but it's also appealing and results in the entire Humongous catalog having a very distinctive art style that you can recognize from a mile away. The crudeness and simplicity conveys a feeling that their entire catalog was made by children and not necessarily just for them. But even without the art style, the entire concept came out of the womb pretty much fully formed. One of the trademarks of Humongous Entertainment games is the ability to click on pretty much anything in the background and have something happen, even if it's completely unrelated to the game itself. The reason is obvious, because the junior adventure concept is aimed at kids 3 to 8. So you want to have a lot of interactability in the game outside of the main path in order to give kids something visual to enjoy, which will keep the youngins engaged, like one of those spinny things you put over a crib. Because if you keep things on the main path, most of these games are less than an hour. Matter of fact, the first game, Putt-Putt Joins the Parade, is about 20 minutes if you know what to do. I didn't know what to do, and it still took me less than a half hour. In this case, all you need to do is tokenly do a few tasks to prepare yourself for the parade. Get a balloon, get a car wash, and get an animal. The animal in question is of course Pep, who doesn't actually start out the series as your companion. You actually find him alone and terrified in a cave and rescue him. That is precious. Otherwise, most of the game is about finding a way to get money together to give yourself a car wash, and how you do that is up to you. I ended up playing that horrible lawn mowing game to get all the money, and ended the game with money to spare to the point where I actually hadn't even delivered some of the groceries I was supposed to deliver for extra money. Also, this game has a mechanic that thankfully went away immediately after. It's not super intrusive, but it could have potentially been annoying. As you go through the game, your gas will gradually run out, and so occasionally you have to run to the gas station to get more gas, which is thankfully free, but it's just unnecessary busy work. Meanwhile, in the second game, you go into space. Not since the Chizo mythos have I seen a game pull that gambit as quickly as that. Thankfully though, this game doesn't have anything nearly as fucking terrible as I just wanted to go into space. In this case, you accidentally have yourself fired into space when you're visiting the fireworks factory. Thankfully, Poochie's not around to ruin that. The rest of the game is spent trying to get back with the help of a lunar moon buggy. The most notable thing about this game is that the puzzle to get the plot kicked off is not self-explanatory whatsoever. I kept making random fireworks combinations hoping that would do something. The solution is, you have to randomly bubble around until you find out that you have to click on the butterfly outside of the window, which will spark a chain of events that will make you blast off like Team Rocket. Otherwise, this is a fairly straightforward game with a fairly straightforward progression. It's not usually totally obvious what you need to do with every item, but once you find every item, the use is usually fairly self-explanatory. The most clever puzzle in the game is having to use Pep to reach a puzzle item, but that's about as clever as it gets. The worst part is probably having to find Robbie Radar in this apartment building, which is apparently a swinger's apartment building because he keeps going from place to place, like, immediately one after another. Or possibly having to get those 10 moon crystals to buy the rocket that will eventually be your ticket home, because you have to do this whack-a-mole game twice, at least. And it's a game that's so easy it's almost mind-numbing. Following that, in Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo, a bunch of baby animals have escaped their enclosures and you have to go rescue them at the behest of the Australian zookeeper.
Jackaroo, you're on!
Who is obviously a reference to Steve Irwin. Rest in peace. And the baby animals are absolutely adorable. My favorite is definitely the lion cub, but I'm very much a cat person, so I'm hardwired to think all felines are cute, even the ones that will literally murder you. As confirmed by the ending credits, all the baby animals are voiced by actual children, which does lend this game a level of authenticity that you don't often get.
Mama, baby Jumbo's coming home!
Matter of fact, for the first 4 main games, Putt-Putt himself is voiced by a boy named Jason Ellefson. I think that's how that's pronounced.
I'm glad everything turned out okay, Masai.
But I'm assuming he grew out of the role, or maybe Humongous Entertainment got too big for him, because by the 5th and 6th games, he's replaced by Nancy Cartwright, most famous for voicing Bart Simpson. This one's also fairly straightforward. The highlight of this game is probably the River Rapids portion, where you have to quickly guide yourself along in order to pick the correct path, and at one point, if you're too slow, you get a Freddy Fish cameo. Peep that. Aside from that, this is probably the easiest game out of the lot. I pretty much intuitively knew exactly what to do with every single item in the game from the moment I got them. I knew the cheese puffs were for the rats, I knew the hot cocoa was for the cold snake, I knew the toolbox was for the winch. Everything was easy to figure out, but despite being the easiest, it's still very charming. Following that is Putt-Putt Travels Through Time. So first we went to the moon, and now we're traveling through time. This is something I kind of appreciate about media like this. You don't have to have a consistent tone or presentation. You can just do wacky shit like this and nobody bats an eye. Meanwhile, in anything that's worth taking remotely seriously as a dramatic piece, time travel is usually the point in which you have officially done a double somersault over a shark. Mentioning no specific examples. In an odd bit of continuity, Mr. Firebird, the fireworks guy from the second game, is now experimenting with time travel and accidentally sends a bunch of Putt-Putt school supplies as well as Pep through time. This one's probably the one I find most annoying out of the entire series, but mostly because you have 4 different time periods that are each disconnected, so you have to keep coming back to the hub to travel through whatever time period you need to go to. And the travel time can be a bit arduous. It was to the point I found myself skipping the animations with the escape key pretty frequently. Other than that, this game is pretty straightforward as soon as you get down to it. There is one particular moment where I was briefly stumped, but only because I had the right idea but wrong execution. This train said he was thirsty, so I thought I had to get a bowl from the prehistoric era, fill it with water, and give it to him, but I actually had to use the rope on this pipe that really didn't stick out from the background all that much. Otherwise, it's a perfectly fine series of item exchanges that won't give you too much trouble if you're any good. The most notable thing I realized when playing this game is the fact that I'm far too cynical and jaded to play these games and view them at face value. Because they are definitely earnest, but I will admit that my mind does occasionally go into dirty places, such as this one dinosaur having a weirdly suggestive voice.
Ms. Brachiosaurus, and who or what in the primordial ooze are you?
Like, am I the only one? And then there's this other dinosaur that begs you to scratch an itch, and thereafter, when you request to walk over him to get to the perch behind him, he has the type of vigorous gusto that you don't often see outside of foot fetishists begging you to step on their face.
As far as I'm concerned, Putt-Putt, you could drive on me all day and night. Be my guest.
I know, I'm terrible. Otherwise than that, it's more the same. Then we get back into slightly more grounded territory with the 5th game, Putt-Putt Joins the Race. This is where the aforementioned Nancy Cartwright takes over.
Extra high-powered, high-octane gasoline! Fill her up!
This one has a few interesting ideas, such as how it kind of goes back to the very first game in the sense that you have to collect money for mandatory and optional reasons. But you have a few different ways to do that. Also, continuing their weirdly consistent continuity, the moon buggy from the second game is back, working a milkshake stand. The only thing inconsistent about this series is the town layout, which is constantly changing. I guess when you're a sentient car, civic restructuring is probably going to be a common thing as you endeavor to make cities less walkable. Also, here's fun. Captain Australia, the zookeeper, is back as one of the major item givers. He just had a lemur delivered and describes the thing as a little bugger.
Stayed home today to take care of the little bugger.
I know that's not a commonly used word in the Americas, but you guys are aware that bugger means bum sex, right? Either way, once again, perfectly straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary for this particular series until the end. I was more or less dreading the idea that they were going to make you actually play the race because it would have no doubt resulted in a terrible minigame. Random sequences of actual gameplay, usually referred to as arcade sequences, aren't anything uncommon when it comes to point-and-click adventure games, much less these games, because most of them have at least one minigame. They're very rarely anything more than mediocre, but at the very least, the more obnoxious ones are usually optional. This one is definitely no exception to the mediocrity rule, but it is indeed mandatory. You just drag your cursor back and forth to avoid obstacles and try to get past the really annoying race car that keeps deliberately driving in front of you. But once you get past that, this minigame is almost insultingly easy, so at the very least it's not as bad as it could have been. But I had really hoped they were gonna surprise me and not make me play it. Well, yeah, they didn't surprise me. Finally, we have Putt-Putt 6, Putt-Putt Joins the Circus. This is definitely the most elaborate out of all the games, because there are 5 parts to the circus you have to save, but in actuality, you have to help out more than double that amount of characters. The type of item exchanges you end up going through are far more multifaceted than previous games. You need to find 2 halves of a health shake recipe so you can then make the health shake, give it to this one strongman car so that he can lift this big weight. Then you take the instruction sheet that the weight was on top of and give it to this one car doing the cannonball act. Also, is it just me or does that car look like Princess Daisy? Another example would be that sequence where you have to take this random umbrella that's laying on the ground to this random sentient unicycle so you can take their umbrella and use it as the new tent for this mini circus. But then you have to go through this multi-stage process of even getting to the sentient unicycle, and then you also have to find the fleas that occupy the mini circus. At which point you have to transport them to the new tent. So they were starting to get a little bit more complicated as they went along, which is something that I appreciate. This game also had another puzzle that briefly stumped me, but only because this game did a very naughty thing and had another mandatory arcade sequence. You see, you have to play this minigame at a peanut vendor to get a bag of peanuts, which you use to wake up a sleeping elephant. Problem being, I had just assumed the minigame was entirely optional because up to that point, most minigames were either optional or obviously not optional. And in this case, this one felt like an optional minigame, although funnily enough, that specific puzzle begets a cameo which continues the weird focus on continuity that this series has. Both the elephants that you interacted with in the 3rd game are in this game, having joined the circus for the summer. I would say Putt-Putt Joins the Circus is probably the best in the series. But keep in mind, we're grading this on a massive curve on account of the fact that this is a series of games that are aimed at an incredibly young audience, and so as an adult, you really won't get much out of it from a brain teaser perspective or from a gameplay perspective. So you really have to reconcile what these games are and how much enjoyment you'll get out of them before comparing them to other games. And in this case, I find Putt-Putt 6 to be the most enjoyable because it has the best production value, the most characters, the most puzzles, the most elaborate puzzles, and while it doesn't necessarily have the most charm, it's definitely up there. And charm really is the word here. I find Putt-Putt to be a very charming series of games with a lot of personality and liveliness. And it's so funny to me that this is a series about anthropomorphic cars that predates the Cars series by well over a decade. Putt-Putt was the most consistent through line that Humongous Entertainment had. It's the first series they produced, and as far as release dates, the final entry is in a tie with Pajama Sam 4 for being the final adventure game they released. I'll save the discussion of Putt-Putt 7 as well as Pajama Sam 4 for the ending portion where I go through the history of Humongous Entertainment's downfall. But either way, their next major franchise was Freddy Fish. Unless you count Fatty Bear, but that really only had one major entry, so personally I don't. While the Putt-Putt series had somewhat of a fantastical dreamlike setup that took you from the streets all the way to the farthest stars and even through space-time, Freddy Fish was strangely more grounded, based around the titular Freddy and her friend Luther.
It says to find Grandma Grouper's treasure chest, go to the volcano. I'm gonna be rich when I find that treasure.
Yeah, fun fact I did not actually know until recently, Freddy is actually a girl. I mean, she does get addressed with female pronouns, but that only happens like twice in the entire series, and both in games I didn't have growing up. The Freddy Fish series consists of Freddy Fish in the case of the missing kelp seeds in 1994, Freddy Fish 2, the case of the haunted schoolhouse in 1996, Freddy Fish 3, the case of the stolen conch shell in 1998, Freddy Fish 4, the case of the hogfish rustlers of Briny Gulch in 1999, and I'm surprised I managed to remember that title without having to go back and double check, and finally Freddy Fish 5, the case of the creature of Coral Cove in 2001. The best way to describe Freddy Fish to the uninitiated would be a series of detective games where we have to solve a mystery by finding clues and key items. Hence why every game is the case of something. Imagine Sherlock and Watson with a piscatorial twist, and also where Sherlock is a girl and Watson is a kleptomaniac. No, seriously, Luther's constantly trying to get rich by stealing stuff, and I find it really funny how that's a running theme in these games, despite the fact that the conflict in these games is supposed to convey simple morality lessons to kids, and one of the things they keep coming back to is stealing. And yet our comedy relief sidekick character keeps getting himself in trouble doing just that. But I digress. I only ever played the first and third games in this series growing up, and more so the third game because the first game actually scared me at times. Something we kind of underestimate is how unsettling the depths of the ocean can be, and there are some screens in that game where you have vast expanses of eerie nothingness, chasms, caverns, and so on. I'm not sure what it was specifically about the imagery, but it did unsettle me. Meanwhile, the third game had a much more upbeat presentation and art style with more compact and busy screens with plenty to interact with. It felt like a much more lively game, whereas the first one felt somewhat dead, but in a way that's kind of cool in hindsight. The eeriness wasn't helped by the plot itself being based around trying to find Grandma Grouper's kelp seeds, without which all the fish will die. Something they're not shy about letting you know, so it's kind of dark when you think about it.
We need to find Grandma Grouper's treasure chest because that's where the kelp seeds are. If we don't find them soon, all the fish are going to die.
It's a pretty upbeat game other than that, even having a short musical number at one point, and also whatever the hell this is.
The super duper duper booka poppy gizmo.
You know what? Fair enough. But the existential aspect of the plot is surprisingly dark, so much so that they scaled the subject matter way the hell back for the next game, which was about setting up an elaborate trap to capture a thief who stole a bunch of toys belonging to the school of fish that Freddy and Luther go to. The first indication that they're school friends. Weirdly, both the first game and second game have the same villains, a couple of sharks working at the behest of an overseeing entity known as the Squid Father. His entire character is a reference to Marlon Brando's fantastic portrayal as Vito Corleone in The Godfather, kind of an unnecessarily cultured reference given the age group we're dealing with. But I'd imagine this was a reference made more for the developer's sake than anyone playing the game. Given that the second game had a much lighter tone than the first, but also starred the same villains and surrounded the idea of them stealing from our characters, one wonders if this was a deliberate attempt at a do-over of the first game after parents complained. I doubt it, but it makes you think. Either way, aside from the dark subject matter and occasionally eerie backgrounds, the first Freddy Fish is fairly straightforward as these things go. You basically have to go around solving a bunch of item puzzles and gathering clues until you're able to pinpoint the exact location of where Grandma's kelp seeds are hidden. And anytime you find a clue, they cut to the two sharks who stole them as they debate amongst themselves. This series more or less came out fully formed, much like Putt-Putt was, as far as how they're structured, and specifically how the game ends with a puzzle sequence largely disconnected from the rest of the game that acts as the climax once you figure out whatever the mystery is. In this case, you have a sequence of puzzles on a sunken ship. The only game that gets away from this is the second game, because in this case you have to go around a bunch of areas to find a bunch of machine parts from which you will build a giant trap. Because the trap is the climax of the story, there's no opportunity to have an extra sequence, meaning the game kind of just ends. Still, it's a perfectly fine game for what it is. I think I prefer the first, and indeed I prefer the third. The third game surrounds them trying to find the missing conch shell, which has been stolen, and Freddy's uncle Blenny has been blamed. So they need to find the conch shell and its 3 pieces and prove Blenny's innocence. What I like about this game is that on account of there being multiple possible culprits, this game has a few different possible playthroughs with different item combinations and sequences. This is a recurring thing throughout the entire Humongous catalog, with different games having different potential playthroughs, incentivizing replayability, but this is probably the most elaborate yet. Still, it always takes you to the same place once you have all 3 pipes for the conch shell. You'll be led to these random ancient ruins where you'll have to break Luther out of prison because the dude stole a gem he wasn't wasn't supposed to. After which, you get a clue which will allow you to finger the culprit, not like that. I would say for sheer variety and creativity, Freddy Fish 3 is probably the best out of all of them, but this is also the one I played the most, so maybe I'm just a bit biased. I played it so much, in fact, that I can pretty distinctly remember all the background details, including this one music box type thing that gives you different short musical numbers, and this one lives rent-free in my head.
I'm the little fishy who's always swimming to and fro. I always eat my seaweed because it helps me grow. Someday I'll be so big and strong I'll never have to fear. But for now I'm a little fishy who is hiding under here.
The fourth game, meanwhile, is comparatively forgettable, as off the top of my head I can't remember much about it. The fourth game concerns Freddy's cousin Calico Catfish, who is an undersea rancher having her hogfish rustled. So that's the investigation. You have to go investigate who did it and have to get her hogfish back.
We got a right to pick a little fight with rustlers. Somebody wants to pick a fight with us, he better bite my ass.
Yeehaw!
This one's definitely more of an investigative game, similar to the third game. You have to solve a bunch of puzzles to get a disguise so you can get into the Rustler's hangout, then you have to gather context clues that will determine who you're gonna finger at the end of the game. Not like that. As much like the third game, one of the people you encounter is the bigwig behind the whole operation, and you have to figure out yourself who did it. I even got it wrong at one point, but in my defense, this dude was a massive red herring. Otherwise, it's fairly straightforward, another case of everything falling into place once you have all the items and talk to all the characters. That belt buckle puzzle is probably the highlight for me. And I enjoy the investigative elements of games like this, although for some reason the game starts to glitch out towards the end. I'm not sure if it's hard baked into the animation or if this is just my copy, but for some reason the voice lines started to completely mess up. Luther started speaking with Freddy's voice lines, and at one point the animation just died altogether while they were talking.
Well, that's no excuse. You all ought to be ashamed. You just shouldn't take things that don't belong to you.
How does that even happen in a game like this that's nothing but hand-drawn animation and voice lines? And the fifth game concerns this amusement park, Coral Cove, being shut down when it's invaded by a mysterious monster. And you have to get in and investigate said monster and find its whereabouts, but in actuality it turns out that said monster is the legal owner of the land, and the villain is a ruthless business owner and land developer trying to steal the land and profit off of it. Which is about as on the nose as anti-capitalist messages get. Which leads to probably the most elaborate ending sequence of all these games. It takes up something like a third of the game and is entirely about you trying to break into this guy's mansion, get to his wall safe, and retrieve the deed so you can return it to its rightful owner. This is easily the best part of the game, which is not to say the rest of it is bad. It's more or less just standard fare. Matter of fact, there's an extended chunk in the beginning of the game where you're trying to solve puzzles just to get into Coral Cove, which takes up, I believe, about a third of the game, meaning the actual investigation is only a third of the game as well. Maybe slightly more than that, but that was my experience with the game. One thing you'll notice when playing these games is that they generally all look the same, which can be lauded for its consistency, but it's interesting that while the industry was developing around it, this series and indeed the entire catalog stay pretty much the same. With that said, however, they do occasionally try new things, and in this game, the thing that stuck out to me the most is this one area with a scrolling background. Now that's definitely the type of stuff you pull out for the final installment, although granted, from what I understand, this wasn't supposed to be the final installment. Either way, I will admit I am slightly biased in this take, but I do like Freddy Fish more than I like Putt-Putt. It has a more consistent identity, and also the subject matter is unique in itself, so you don't need to resort to crazy subject matter just to have cool backgrounds, interesting theming, and fun subject matter. Plus, I find the Holmes and Watson relationship between Freddy and Luther very endearing. Then the general investigative elements means that the games are slightly more elaborate than a series of item exchanges until you win. The thing about Putt-Putt especially is that because you're usually getting to a specific goal by fixing a problem, the game sort of just abruptly ends as soon as you fix the problem. Whereas by having an investigation and final payoff, you have more of a deliberate structuring that makes the payoff feel earned. But no shade, that's just my opinion. I find both of these franchises to be good for what they are, in their own right. Following this, their third major pillar franchise in the Junior Adventure series was Pajama Sam, and Pajama Sam was my jam. This was the series that I played the most by far out of all these different Junior Adventure franchises growing up. This series consists of Pajama Sam, No Need to Hide When It's Dark Outside from 1996, Pajama Sam 2, Thunder and Lightning Aren't So Frightening in 1998, Pajama Sam 3, You Are What You Eat From Your Head to Your Feet in 2000, and Pajama Sam 4, Life is Rough When You Lose Your Stuff in 2003. This is a series of games that really feels like it's coming directly from the imagination of a child, where you get the sense that every single one of them is an adventure within a child's mind to try and use their limited understanding of the world to try and make sense of something they don't understand. Overcoming a fear of the dark, overcoming a fear of thunderstorms, and the importance of having a balanced diet. This is something I remember doing as a kid. If there was something I didn't understand, I would use my own understanding of how the world worked to spackle over the gaps. Completely random example. When I was super young, I remember hearing that mustard seeds were a thing, and in my head, that's what I imagined bottles of mustard coming from. I don't mean like mustard the substance, I mean like actual bottles of mustard. So this is a series that takes that concept and expands it out into entire adventures. Notably, the voice of Sam in the first 3 games is Pamela Adlon, most famous for being the voice of Bobby Hill on King of the Hill, though personally I'm more familiar with her role as Spinelli in the show Recess, a show that I do not know how I feel about even to this day. I remember not particularly liking it growing up, but still watching it every single day.
This looks like a job for Pajama Sam!
Either way, despite being more familiar with this franchise than the rest of the franchises, I never played the first game growing up. We got the second and third games at the bottom of a cereal box, and I played those games relentlessly. Having only played the first game for curiosity's sake in my adult years, I can honestly say that I think this is the best one of the lot. Since it's about overcoming fear of the dark, the graphics are gloomy but still very colorful. Plus, I love the detail that since this is all technically taking place in Sam's closet, that his various belongings are spread throughout the game world. And there's so much charm to these characters, especially with all the sentient objects that each have a distinct personality. From the furniture that dance but then stop dancing the moment you enter the room, to the singing kitchen appliances, to the communist carrot revolutionary freedom fighter, to Sam himself, who's just a lovable goofball.
Bada boom, bada boom, bada boom, bada boom, bada boom.
I'm not sure what he's supposed to be. He's like a blue golem creature and has that Simpsons thing where you can't tell where his hair ends and his forehead begins. I also wanted to make special mention of this one boat who kinda sounds like Engine from the Crash Bandicoot games.
Yeah, that was fun! Let's do it again!
How about not right away, okay?
We meet again. Uka Uka and Dr. Cortex want me to teach you a lesson.
I especially like this one part where he's explaining geysers to Sam, and it goes on for so long they literally throw up a disclaimer on the screen. That's funny. I know these games tend to be smarter than their audiences to begin with, but that is a classic. As for the game itself, it's very clever but still deceptively straightforward. Some playthroughs are harder than others, and I remember my first playthrough I ever did, I actually got stuck at one point, but only because I couldn't for the life of me find the grandfather clock. Turns out it was off in another corner with no indication that there was an extra walkable path. I'm not sure if that's my lack of observational skill or just a bit of shoddy art design. Either way, this is another series that came out fully formed. I have nothing but good things to say. The only game of the 4 to rival the first game's quality, I would say, is the second game. This is a case where there's a thunderstorm raging and Sam has to go on a quest to try and stop the storm. So he climbs up to his attic, which has a convenient path to worldwide weather, the control station for all weather. Also, check that out. What were they feeding him as a baby? Bowling balls? Either way, once Sam gets to the control room of worldwide weather, he steps on his cape and somehow creates enough elastic force to propel himself across the room straight into the big red button that ruins everything. I don't understand why that was a thing. Maybe that's like an emergency shutdown thing, but I'd think you'd want that as a small red button under a glass case. Either way, this creates a massive kerfuffle within the weather station, and you need to fix everything before Mother Nature shows up and Thunder and Lightning get in trouble. They're also deceptively nice to Sam, despite the fact that he was the one who just barged into their workspace and potentially cost them their jobs.
Lightning and I have important work to do here, so we need you to help fix the weather machine.
My favorite part of this game is clicking on the screens and getting these random wacky weather reports.
How's the weather?
It's raining frogs in Frankfurt.
How's the weather?
It's hailing taxicabs in Texas.
How's the weather?
The Black Sea is turning orange.
And then there's Seattle.
Hey, that one looks sunny.
I know. Unfortunately, that's Seattle. Oh, what a mess.
This is actually one of 2 digs that Humongous Entertainment takes at Seattle in their games. They were based out of Washington, so presumably they had some sort of axe to grind. As usual, the sequences of puzzles are pretty self-explanatory. There are a few more things that aren't as self-explanatory, but nothing you can't figure out. I think the one thing that gave me trouble when I replayed this game for the first time in like 20 years back in 2020 was when you have to get the Y-pipe out of the vending machine with a couple of coins. How do you get the coins? You have to go to this weather simulator and select the option to make a rainbow, and then there's a pot of gold that will appear that will give you a couple of coins. To quote myself from back then, that's not logic. That's a loony on a sesame seed bun. The thing about this game, though, is that it used to unsettle me, particularly the idea that Mother Nature is gonna roll in and be all scary and stuff. I mean, the design doesn't help. She looks like an onion, so that's kinda creepy. Still, in hindsight, it's creative, it's elaborate, and it's varied. It's a pretty damn good junior adventure game in my book. After this, you have You Are What You Eat From Your Head to Your Feet, which I consider the weakest of the first 3 games, even if it is the one I played the most. This one's about Sam trying to compartmentalize the idea of having a healthy diet after he splurges on cookies to try and get enough box tops to get a Pajama Man action figure. Yeah, Pajama Man's kind of a recurring thing in this series, as well as the idea of collecting things, because when you're in the game, you can collect all 20 box tops, but much like the collectibles in the first 2 games, which I didn't even bother mentioning, it's nothing that really results in anything worth the trouble. The reason why I think this game is the weakest is that while it has some variability like the first 2 games, and you can even decide which choices to make, a large chunk of this game is predetermined. You always have to break out of prison, you always have to get to the food pyramid, you always have to feed this guy fries with his preferred sauce. You're probably about a third of the way through the game before any potential playthrough variety takes place, and even then, I find that this game is also the easiest of all the games, and for a series aimed at elementary school kids, that is saying something. Still, that isn't to say this is bad or anything, just weaker. I still love all the characters, the gourd guards who won't let you pass by unless you're a gourd.
Oh, wait a minute. It's gourds only, right?
Yes, and he's a gourd, so I guess that means,
The plumbers, and I never caught this as a kid, but I love how they're deliberately shaped to make a plumber's crack on their head. But the pun of plumbers is enough deniability that they can get away with that. Then there's the Beans, the Crying Onion Librarian, and of course General Beatfoot.
Alright, that's it! This means war!
You see, the plot of the game is that General Beatfoot is determined to go to war against the other food groups, only being restrained by Carrot, who's a returning character. So you need to gather all the delegates of various food groups together for a peace negotiation. Unlike most peace negotiation meetings these days, though, thanks to Sam, it actually goes well once he makes a speech about how great food can only exist once the different food groups work together.
All the best things to eat are made by different kinds of food working together. And that's what you should all be doing.
Which is actually a very clever analogy about how humanity and society can only be good once we as humans decide to work together regardless of our differences. It's just a shame I don't enjoy this game as much as the first 2 games. But as a whole, there's a reason why Pajama Sam was my jam. Something about it just captures the chaotic inner workings of a child's imagination so authentically. The way there's so much random chaos that feels simultaneously like controlled chaos. So it makes sense in its own weird way because it has to make sense for it to be in someone's imagination. One's imagination can be random, but it's the type of random that has its own logic. Without that, these games will come across as inauthentic, and this is very authentic and clever and filled to the brim with personality. I may not engage with these games as much as I used to on account of no longer being part of the target audience, but I do enjoy the hell out of these games from a subject matter point of view. Once again, there is a final game, but we'll cover that once it comes up. Then we have the last of the big 4 intellectual properties, Spy Fox, starring the titular Spy Fox. That's how he introduces himself, so presumably that's his name.
My name's Fox. Spy Fox.
This is a series where you follow an anthropomorphic fox who's an international spy along with his cabal of companions, most notably Monkey Penny, who, let's be honest, is probably the #1 most searched page on the wiki, and Professor Quack as they investigate and solve matters of international importance. Now, Spy Fox is a series of games that I had the least amount of experience with overall before this. I played quite a lot of Freddy Fish and Pajama Sam growing up, and I'd seen a number of videos on the Putt-Putt series. Spy Fox, meanwhile, is one of those things that always just kind of existed. However, I do know for a fact that it is arguably the most beloved series of games out of all of these, despite the fact that there was only 3 main games. Now, having experienced these games, I kind of understand why, and I have to pay my respects to Spy Fox because I went into it expecting it to be on the level of the other games in the Humongous Entertainment catalog, but Spy Fox comes across to me as almost on the level of your average graphic adventure game, not necessarily one made for kids. Because these other IPs are basically as straightforward as it gets. Like I said before, by the time you have every mandatory item, you pretty much know exactly what to do with all of them. Meanwhile, Spy Fox is a series that has multiple moving pieces. Aside from the standard inventory items, you also have various spy gadgets you can use, and while much like a lot of other Humongous Entertainment games, different playthroughs will yield different gameplay paths, you have access to all gadgets. Meaning that you're inevitably not going to use all of them, but you may not know which ones you should take, and the application is not always self-explanatory. So it actually requires a bit of deduction about what is used for what specific circumstance. Then there's a third layer of the game design with the conversations. If you talk to someone, you may have the option to talk about them to other people, which will either be a puzzle in itself or will give you insight into solving a puzzle. And more than anything, there are a lot of puzzles in these games that don't require items at all. It's purely down to observational skill and deduction. For example, in the first game, you need to know to talk to this bear about this specific person so that the bear will tell you that his shift ends 33 minutes after happy hour. Then you need to go outside and see what the hours for happy hour are and make that deduction about what to set the ship's computer to in order for him to leave his post. Later on, there's also a puzzle based around putting the date and day of the week. You need to know to go to this specific terminal to find the date, and then you need to check the daily specials at the cantina to find out what day of the week it is. And that's only 2 examples. They're not necessarily complicated if you know what to do, but if you're going in blind, you're probably gonna end up stumped a few times. Because I sure did, and I'm not too proud to admit that. It's still nowhere near the level of like a Sierra adventure game, for example, but it's not quite as straightforward as you might expect it to be. If I had to guess, Putt-Putt 1 was released in 1992. Meanwhile, the first Spy Fox game was released in 1997. 5 years is a lot when you're a kid, so if I had to guess, I'm thinking they saw their target audience was getting a little bit older and maybe wanted something a little more challenging, and you know what? I think it's great. The deductions and various puzzles in these games capture that feeling of being a spy, having to figure things out for yourself. The 3 games in the series were Spy Fox in Dry Cereal, which came out in 1997, Spy Fox 2 Some Assembly Required in 1999, and Spy Fox 3 Operation Ozone, which came out in 2001. Spy Fox in Dry Cereal is a very odd name, but it's pretty indicative of the game. A villain named William the Kid, a goat, has kidnapped all dairy milk cows on the planet in an attempt to cause a massive flood with the world's milk supply, which will make everyone turn on the cows, thereby allowing goat milk to reign supreme. You know, that is a series of non sequiturs that either indicates a supreme level of creativity or a supreme level of LSD. It is a remarkably stupid but fun plot, and of course it's carried relatively well by Spy Fox himself, voiced by Mike Middoy.
Just watch this spy heat the joint up with a demo of his spy heat.
And what really sells him as the character is his extreme nonchalant demeanor, that smug look on his face, his very low-key, kind of suave voice acting, as well as his tendency to make terrible puns.
This Nectar of the Goat's jumpsuit might be just the thing I need to get the jump on William the Kid.
I don't know, he's a fun character, and I find it funny how he very rarely emotes beyond the bare minimum. Not until he stabs himself with a prickly pear in the 3rd game.
Yow!
I think Lavinia from Trials of Apollo did something similar. The first game is probably the best out of all 3 of the main entries. It's the one where I remember most of the puzzles. There is one puzzle that I was very frustrated with, which is the fishhook puzzle. The timing on hooking the guard is slightly fiddly, but this game has creativity and cleverness out the wazoo. Outside of the things I've mentioned, I think the puzzle that sticks out to me the most is the puzzle surrounding which of the grid spaces to go to in order to find where the secret facility is. Then again, it shouldn't have been hard to miss considering it was turning the sea white. Incidentally, once again, I feel like I'm too cynical for these games because I thought that looked like something else. What can I say? It had to be thick and viscous in order for a concentration so high that it creates a blotch on the sea this opaque. If it was the same consistency as the water around it, well, it would have mixed in a lot more. Anyways, enough talking about spunk. Another thing I appreciate about this game is that the requisite mandatory arcade sequence is one of the better ones in the entire history of Humongous. Because it's a card game, and something that simple is perfect for a graphic adventure game. Specifically, you have to play Go Fish. And I'm surprised they didn't include Freddy Fish on the cards, given their tendency of crossing over franchises, and this is the game that taught me to always pay attention while playing, because I did not realize that to get the true ending, you had to be paying attention and click on this milk truck at the right time, which puts you in the final puzzle sequence, which is kind of indicative of the final sequence of all these games, in that the final sequences of all three of these games are the easiest parts of their respective games. All the deduction and cleverness kind of goes out the window as you just press a few things together and capture the bad guy. Either way, Spy Fox 1, easily one of the more memorable games in the entire catalog. Spy Fox 2, Some Assembly Required, meanwhile, is probably the weakest of all three games. In this case, you're at what's called the World Fair, and you need to investigate this villain named Napoleon LaRoche and his society of meaningless evil, larceny, lying, and yelling, otherwise known as Smelly. The villain LaRoche is bitter because as a kid, he couldn't get into the fair because he was too short. So now he's built a giant mechanical dog that will wake up and terrorize the world once the guest count at the World Fair reaches 1 million. This one kinda just takes place within the World Fair, unlike the previous game which had multiple different locations that you went to. Okay, that's not necessarily true. You do have a section in the beginning in the Alps where you meet up with the Canadian Spy Corps, which for some reason are there. I'd imagine it's probably parodying a James Bond movie I haven't seen, but otherwise, you mostly just go from location to location to location in this single fair. And there are some clever deduction puzzles, particularly I was a fan of that one puzzle where you have to get into the evil dog bot by stealing rose-tinted glasses and then spying on the guards going into the entrance of the dog bot, followed by a puzzle wherein you need to make a specific dish by cloning a pickle at a cloning facility. Keep in mind, for some of these games I am playing through them for the first time and only playing through them once, so there's a possibility that I'm missing out on some of the more clever puzzles, but I still think my opinion stands in this case because of the lack of variety in locations. But much like last time, you foil the evil plot, LaRoche tries to get away, but you follow him into his lair and capture him before he can get away. And then the final game in the main series is Operation Ozone. This one has an introductory scene that is almost a shot-for-shot parody of the opening of GoldenEye. But the rest of the plot is about this villain named Poodles Galore, whose name is probably a parody of Pussy Galore. She's a makeup specialist who's decided to try and destroy the ozone with a large aerosol can because then her powerful SPF 2001 sunscreen will sell gangbusters. This barely strikes me as a parody. This feels like something a corrupt CEO would do IRL. Christ, don't give Elon ideas. But anyways, the plot is largely based around finding ingredients for what's called the congeal pill so you can break into the aerosol can and stop the spray. In this case, it feels like the developers heard my complaints through time and decided to include 4 separate distinct locations for various puzzles. Once again, this one is all about observation, skill, and cleverness. And I think pretty much every puzzle I can remember off the top of my head is fairly elaborate. In my playthrough, there was one part where I had to get a beekeeper hat so I could break into a prickly pear farm, but they wouldn't let me leave with it, so I had to put it on a plank and send it downstream, but not before turning the crank on the reservoir so the plank wouldn't go down the waterfall. And it's funny, the person you get the beekeeper hat from is a recurring female bear character, and she's among some of my favorite characters in this series.
Is there anything I can get you, honey? Say, for instance, honey?
She constantly gives you so much shit, and the running gag about how she just so happens to be working the most important odd jobs in each game, that's clever, and it actually reminds me of a character I have planned for a sitcom pitch I'm putting together. The other highlight for me is when you have to get a specific variety of beauty clay, and you have to suss out that the description of the clay will determine where you have to grab the clay from. The ending is a bit lame though, because Poodles Galore prevents you from throwing the congeal pill into the spray, and the solution is to do the exact same thing again. It's really lame, but then you have another ending sequence where you have to capture the villain once and for all, and that's that. Turns out Monkey Penny can kick more ass than Spy Fox. Honestly, a very solid trilogy of games. Of course, there are spin-offs, and in fact, all these games have spin-offs, but in all honesty, I have no interest in them. For me, it's all about the main series games. What I like about these different franchises is that they each had drastically different feels to them. With Pajama Sam, you got the sense that it was a game entirely constructed from a child's boundless imagination. Spy Fox is a spy thriller pared down to a childlike whimsical level. Putt-Putt feels straight out of a children's storybook, and Freddy Fish feels like a fun investigation series made infinitely better by setting it underwater, which allows for so much creativity. Which is not to say these 4 franchises were the only things they made, merely that they were the pillars, the base by which everything was built around. They also made some Blue's Clues games, several more decisively edutainment games, and of course the Backyard Sports franchise, which included backyard baseball, soccer, football, and basketball before the end of 2001. Only a few of these games have an official modern release, although apparently more are in development by a team called Mega Cat Studios. Although I'm not entirely sure why they haven't been able to re-release them, at least up to a certain point. Most of these games were also developed on the SCUMM engine, which is kind of impressive to make games that high quality in an engine specifically made for point-and-click adventure games. And the big reason why all the big pillar point-and-click adventure games were able to be translated to so many various platforms is because the SCUMM engine is still being supported and updated to this day. You may question why the same company who owns the Junior Adventure games don't also own the Backyard Sports games, and that's because the Backyard Sports franchise, and that alone, was sold to a different company than the Junior Adventure games, and after several mergers and acquisitions, the franchise now belongs to a company called Playground Productions, who are the ones who commissioned the various remasters and re-releases. As far as my opinion on the Backyard Sports games, given the fact that they're not available for purchase, I've not played them, and even growing up, my experiences with them began and ended with the demo discs. I will say with absolute certainty that I would have loved them had I played them just based on what little sampling I had. And this is a series to this day that outside of the Junior Adventure games are most fondly remembered by a lot of people, especially because they were the most popular of all the games that Humongous Entertainment made on average. To put things into perspective, from what I could dig up, the Backyard Sports franchise sold a combined 15 million copies, which is roughly on the same level as every game in the Junior Adventure series combined, and from what I understand, the vast majority of the Backyard Sports sales were before 2001. Which means the vast majority of those sales came from 5 or 6 games. But the Junior Adventure series still sold respectably for what they were. And that's kind of where my personal experience with these games ends, which brings us to the most depressing part of proceedings. So what ended up happening to Humongous Entertainment? Well, truth be told, it is a whopper of a story, to the point where I didn't believe half of what I was reading. So in July of 1996, Humongous Entertainment was sold to GT Interactive for no less than $76 million. Keep in mind, this was before they hit their apex, so they still had upward mobility at this point, yet they still got sold for what is at time of writing the equivalent of $152 million. And things were going great. Putt-Putt was still going strong, Freddy Fish was going strong, Pajama Sam and Backyard Sports were on the horizon. They struck a deal with Nickelodeon to make the aforementioned Blue's Clues games. Everything seemed to be looking up. Unfortunately, in 1999, facing financial issues, Infogrames bought a majority stake in GT Interactive. And this is where things get interesting and slightly depressing, because if you know anything about Infogrames, you know that it was one of the most tragically mismanaged game publishers, despite at the time being among some of the biggest games publishers out there. If you look up the trail of bodies they left behind, it rivals something like EA, and I do not say that lightly. Now, the history of Humongous Entertainment post-Infogrames acquisition is long and complicated, and there are people far more qualified than I who can go over the bits and pieces, but here's more or less what happened. At first, things weren't actually so bad. The company seemingly puttered along until 2001, as it had been doing for several years. However, the first cracks emerged in 2000. You see, the original founders Ron Gilbert and Shelley Day wanted to buy back ownership from Infogrames. Everything was going as planned. They had backers who were willing to fund the purchase, they had a verbal agreement to buy the company from Infogrames, and then something happened that's so coincidental I still don't fully believe it actually happened. Apparently the exact day the purchase was supposed to be formalized was the exact day that it was commonly agreed that the dot-com bubble burst. The dot-com bubble is a whole separate topic that's too complicated for me to go into, but long story short, in the mid to late 90s, the rapid rise of the internet led to a rapid rise of tech startups and a massive amount of venture capital being invested. But the insane amount of startups at the same time led to an inevitable collapse when there were too many startups, too much investment, and not enough money to go around. leading to a bunch of tech startups suddenly going out of business, which led to a massive fire sale of stock, which made the value of all the stock completely collapse. When that collapse happened appears to be, by my research, March 10th, 2000, where the Nasdaq opened at 5,060, but by March 13th had already dropped to 4,879. Incidentally, the 10th was a Friday, so that's why we don't have any info for the 11th and 12th. Either way, with all these startups starting to face massive debt, venture capital dried up, so Mr. Gilbert and Mrs. Day lost their funding and the deal ultimately fell through, meaning that they, along with several key members of staff, left the company shortly thereafter. And this is where Infogrames started to stick their fingers into the pie because they didn't like the way the company was structured. They started expecting far too much profit for far too little budget, much like many companies. They weren't satisfied with making some money, they wanted to make all the money. And while the core pillar content of Humongous Entertainment's catalog was still making some money, just not a ton of money, there was one thing in their output that was making money pretty much hand over fist. That being the backyard sports games. So in 2001, Infogrames did 3 things to show off their incompetence. 1, they laid off 40% of the work staff within the company. 2, they cancelled several unnamed projects, one of which was apparently Freddy Fish 6, and 3, they refocused all their efforts into the backyard sports franchise. The only exception to this was Moonbase Commander in 2002. But the fact that it exists is the extent of my knowledge about it. You can buy it on Steam, and based on the Steam page, it looks like it reviewed well and is beloved by the people who have played it, but there's probably a reason why I've never heard of it. And that hunch was proven correct. According to one of the Steam reviews I read, Infogrames basically buried this game because they're a bunch of incompetent pricks. The junior adventure concept was officially dead, at least for the time being. That was until the company came under the ownership of Atari Inc. Now, this is where things get really confusing to the point where I actually had to outsource my research to YouTuber Shadowstreak. So basically, Infogrames SA was the main holding company. The SA in this case, which is a very unfortunate acronym, is a French acronym meaning... Société Anonyme. The American equivalent is a PLC, or Public Limited Company, basically an overseeing force that owns several subsidiaries. Their American game publishing branch was Infogrames Inc. Then Infogrames SA purchased the Atari branding from Hasbro Interactive in 2003. Then their American publishing branch was then renamed to Atari Inc. And that's only the necessary information. The labyrinth of subsidiary names is disastrous. Either way, once the rebrand happened, Humongous Entertainment was then commissioned for 2 new junior adventure games. Pajama Sam 4, Life is Rough When You Lose Your Stuff, and Putt-Putt 7, Pep's Birthday Surprise. I was saving this until this chunk because I almost feel like these games are such tragic departures from their previous iterations that they can't be discussed in the same sentence. First of all, both these games have a really outdated copy protection that means you need the disc in order for it to play. However, these games have been getting sold digitally for years at this point, so there's no actual way to play with the disc. In fact, I haven't even owned a disc drive since like 2015. However, thanks to the magic of drive emulators, you can trick the games into running. Pep's Birthday Surprise is probably the better of the two. The entire game is based around the fact that Pep's depressed because he's never had a birthday party, and so Putt-Putt decides to celebrate his gotcha day as his actual birthday, which just so happens to be the next day. How convenient. So basically, this entire series took place in the space of a year. This guy attracts adventure like Gwyneth Paltrow attracts lawsuits. Puzzle-wise, this game is pretty much on the same level as the other games, just with the added dimension of having to constantly distract Pep so he doesn't know that he's getting a surprise party, which really just adds an extra button to press between doing things that you want to do, which gets especially annoying in sequences where you need to talk to the same character several times. And it leads to this funny scenario where Pep is basically a live-in servant fetching you 6 different cups of hot cocoa. And the repeated animations do get a bit annoying as well, but that's because they switched to the skip animation button. It used to be escape, now it's enter. I didn't know that until I had already finished the game. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the puzzles themselves, it's just the presentation really suffers. You can tell that this was a game that was given an extremely small budget. There's a lot of areas that appear to be outright recycled from the previous games. The voice acting is much more amateurish to the point where I'm half convinced they just got friends of people from the studio to voice characters.
This is the special bag Mrs. Widget gave me to store all of the items I need for Pep's party.
The animation is fairly minimal when they can get away with it, the backgrounds are less reactive, and it just doesn't have the same creativity or life that the previous games had. Honestly, in a lot of ways that are kind of hard to pin down. It comes across to me as though without the main driving forces behind these games, it feels like it's almost a parody of an established work rather than an authentic piece of work. And while Shelley Day and Ron Gilbert were important to the development of a lot of these games, it's obvious that among the people who left, as well as the people who were laid off, there were a lot of important figures there that were no longer with the company, whose presence you wouldn't even notice when they were there, but were responsible for a lot of little bits and pieces that made the games what they were. And with that in mind, Pajama Sam 4, Life is Rough When You Lose Your Stuff. This is easily my least favorite game out of all the junior adventure games. It's just so painfully mediocre. It has all the issues that Putt-Putt 7 had, except maybe even worse. Plus, it has plenty of flaws in its own right. First of all is the wishy-washy theming, which is ironic because there's a washing machine in the game, to the point where I'm not even sure what this game is attempting to convey. Possibly that being clean is good, but let's back up. Pajama Man is coming to a local mall, and Sam wants to have his vintage Pajama Man 1 autographed. It's going to suck when he grows up and realizes it's just some guy in a suit. But when he tries to retrieve his comic, he ends up in the land of messiness, and the whole thing is decidedly low energy and lacking in creativity, like how the entire climax of the story is about getting into some mall, so you have to go around collecting the necessary clothing items. That way the guard will let you in. There is some misplaced effort, like a really weirdly elaborate but somehow low-budget musical number that goes on for way too long.
Free from dirt and filth and food debris, but what good is a spotless heart when we're a pair?
The imagery is muddled and not visually appealing, and I don't know, something feels distinctly wrong about this. Like the whole experience feels off, much like Putt-Putt 7 felt off.
Oops.
Except it feels worse here. It feels like a poor imitation that has worse presentation in pretty much every way. And unfortunately, that would be the final stain that would be etched into this once proud concept. As even with the sports games continuing to be made after this, the company was not long for the world. Things once again get a bit complicated. Back when I was doing casual research into Humongous Entertainment back in 2020, I remember reading that Atari sold Humongous back to Infogrames, and there was an agreement that the games that were in development would continue to be worked on until at least March 31st, 2006. Earlier revisions of the Wikipedia article do confirm that this was indeed something that was stated, however the facts have been reshuffled. Now it states that Atari merely retained the publishing rights through until the end of March 2006, and it was later extended. It just shows me that even in death, the behind-the-scenes aspects of this company couldn't stop being a complete mess. As even in death, nobody can quite agree on when the company officially closed down. At least at time of writing, the agreed upon date is August 22nd, 2006, which would coincide with Atari selling the company back to Infogrames, which then resulted in all staff being laid off, which I guess is as good of a time as any to declare time of death. But why would they purchase all their assets back if they were just going to close down the company? Well, aside from being generally incompetent, Infogrames then took the assets and established Humongous Ent, another holding company which would then continue to make the backyard sports titles, which, believe it or not, kept going until 2010. So that means, if I'm not mistaken, the last official game made by the company proper was Backyard Skateboarding featuring Andy McDonald, which initially released about a month after the staff were laid off, and that is a bomb-ass game to go out on if it is their last game. Despite being short, easy, and lacking controller support, it is a smooth and authentic Tony Hawk style game that I thoroughly enjoy. If you want my more in-depth thoughts on it, you can watch my video on the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater knockoff collection. So yeah, as far as I'm aware, that is an accurate retelling of the demise of Humongous Entertainment based on what we currently know. But the story does kind of have a happy ending in a cosmic sort of way. Basically what happened was, in 2008, Infogrames was able to finally fully purchase the Atari branding outright, and so they rebranded the entire company from Infogrames SA to Atari SA. Unfortunately, those years of mismanagement and executive ineptitude finally caught up to them. You see, they were losing money hand over fist for roughly a decade by this point. But then in 2013, the entity formerly known as Infogrames officially declared bankruptcy. From that, over 100 different intellectual properties were then sold to a company called Tomo Inc. And while they never released any new games in any of these franchises, they were the ones who eventually made these games available for purchase on Steam, Good Old Games, and various consoles. So thankfully, we did get a company that cares enough to still archive these classic games to those who are nostalgic enough to indulge. Perhaps even showing their own kids the games that they grew up with. But with that said, these games and the company that made them more or less only exist as nostalgic beacons of a past age at this point, because Humongous Entertainment is a company that doesn't really exist anymore. Simply the assets belong to a different host. No developers are actually working for Humongous Entertainment. There's no chance of a comeback, which is a tragic fate, but with that said, I don't think for a second that Humongous Entertainment was really gonna last even without the unfortunate circumstances surrounding its death, because it kind of existed in a niche that doesn't really exist anymore. You see, it's reasonable to assume to a certain extent that if the company was still making money, it wouldn't have been shut down. And it would make perfect sense why the games they were making weren't selling the same amount that they used to, and the data backs it up. What it comes down to is that their primary audience grew up. You see, when you had the perfect trinity of wholesome entertainment, the mainstreamification of family PCs, and games that could be run on even the most modestly powerful PCs, you had something that was perfect for kids growing up in the early to mid-90s. But unfortunately, those kids grew up, and in some cases, you have styles of entertainment that are essentially evergreen. Despite the fact that there will always be different shows being made, for example, watching cartoons has appealed to multiple generations one after another. So you'll always have an equal replacement rate, so the people growing out of it will be replaced by the people growing into it, if you see what I mean. But because the popularity of Humongous Entertainment came at such a specific time for such specific reasons, it doesn't take that much time for the entertainment landscape to completely move on, leaving that niche behind. By the time the early 2000s hit and the company started to die off, you had things like the rise of Web 2.0 and the rise of Flash gaming. You had the rise of online gaming with things like Halo leading the charge. The entire industry was starting to shift in a more action-focused and adult-focused direction. I bring up this example a lot because it perfectly showcases what I mean. Jason Rubin on livestream talking about how by 2002 the entire industry changed overnight so that kids wanted more mature games because mature games were seen as the cool and in thing to play.
This Grand Theft Auto 3 thing came out and utterly changed the expectations of the gaming community. And like literally overnight, everything changed. We had already started working on Jak 2, and I remember doing a focus group and two 8-year-olds were in this focus group. And I was like, so what do you think? And they acted like 16-year-olds, like 8-year-olds. Well, the graphics are good, and we really like the gameplay. We like what you're doing and the expansion of the universe. Really, this would be a fantastic game for our little brothers. And you're like, you're 8.
And as confirmed by various sources, the same applied for the rapidly shrinking niche that Humongous Entertainment was selling by the early 2000s. Plus, even the most modestly powerful PCs at that point could handle things way more demanding than what they could do 10 years prior, to the point where simple point-and-click adventure games were considered ancient technology. And the way I see it, there was no way for Humongous Entertainment to adapt to that changing landscape. Their games were far too kiddie and far too entrenched in the point-and-click adventure genre to ever be properly separated from the genre. What were they gonna do? A game about a grown-up Freddy Fish as a police detective? A Hitman-style adventure game starring Spy Fox? A superhero sandbox game starring Pajama Sam? I'm sure some people are probably listening to me saying this and thinking, hell yeah, I love that idea. No, you wouldn't, is the thing. And I always go back to this example. These sort of ironic subversions work in a micro sense, like if you made a 2-minute YouTube parody, but as an official release, it would be nothing short of laughable. The only reason one could say it would be awesome is because we have the luxury of not being in a universe where they exist. And if they actually did exist, the tune of these people would be very different. Like, are we not all in agreement that Bomberman Act Zero was a conceptual misfire? That's only one example. There was an entire decade where companies tried to update traditionally lighthearted IP into dark, gritty BS to mixed success. Humongous Entertainment essentially built into a fad that ceased to exist once their own audience grew out of their products, and the audience that may have hypothetically replaced their original audience were interested in much different things. They were no longer needed, and the company faded away accordingly. These days, we live in a much more homogeneous entertainment landscape where the line between things that children can enjoy and the things that adults can enjoy is somewhat blurred. Plus, there's so much media being thrown at us at any given time that things of all varieties exist. And with the rise of ironic internet culture, things that were previously never particularly popular have found their niches. Basically, anything can theoretically exist and be successful even beyond their specific fads in the past. And it's in that particular landscape that the games were re-released. Granted, they're way overpriced, but that's besides the point. We'll probably continue to get re-releases of these games until the end of time, which, at the rate things are going, will probably be next week. But we'll probably never get new installments, and you know what? I'm not too hung up on it either way. Why? Because they had a good run. It goes back to my point about how good things don't need to go on forever for us to enjoy it. Just with their core junior adventure franchises, they made no less than 20 games, 26 if you count Blue's Clues. There's plenty to go around, so why lament what you don't have when you can just enjoy what you do have? But I also will acquiesce to the fact that I'm not part of the target audience, obviously, and that's kind of what makes me more comfortable in saying that I'm okay with these things being archived, but not necessarily continued. You see, I do enjoy these games in a sense. I find them very charming, but as I said earlier, you're kind of grading them on a curve because I'll never get as much enjoyment out of these games as I would with most other games, regardless of what the specific target audience is. They are good for what they are, but for what they are is the operative phrase there. It's important to keep things in perspective, if you ask me. It is kind of unfortunate, though, looking back on the life and death of Humongous Entertainment, because things like this just remind me that the world I grew up in is long dead. It's easy to re-experience the things we grew up with and get lost in the memories, but once it's all said and done, it's all dust in the wind. Sometimes I'll drive around on my way to the gym or whatever, and I'll pass by an old spot I used to hang out in, and it's almost inevitably completely different from how it used to be, 5, 10, or 15 years ago. And that stark difference is only going to become more noticeable as time goes on, and the same applies for the people younger than me. Time goes on, things change, and all those things that defined your life for so long, dust in the wind. And this company, these games, no different. And that's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And I'm happy to announce I'm going to be relaunching my Patreon in February, so if you want to jump on that, you can pledge anytime. Also, thank you to user Shadowstreak. His video on Humongous helped to fill in a few of the gaps of my knowledge that helped make the video. Go check out his video on Humongous as well, it's a lot more comprehensive than mine. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.